Such a pleasure to be here, and I'm always delighted at the opportunity to work and share with peers my experiences in advocacy and government relations and policy influencing. And also, so far, it's been great to also hear a bit about other people's experiences as well. So thank you so much to yourself, Puneet, and others for organizing this space for that shared collaboration and that shared learning. So I do have a bit of a presentation that I wanted to share. So I'll just get a sense if I can share it, and I think I will be. But just to start to preface, today what I'll be doing is I'll share a bit about my journey. And I think this is really important to share because there's different parts of my journey that have helped inform my advocacy style and government relations style. And I also invite you to reflect on your own experiences, because each of the different experiences we bring to the table actually enable us to be better advocates and better policy influencers. So that's something I really wanted to encourage all of you listening in at home and remotely. I also will be doing a bit of a case study approach on different campaigns I've been part of over the years that have really helped to activate and inspire collective action and also influence the public discourse. So for each of the cases I'll be talking about the different ways we created opportunities for folks to participate in collective action and also influence the public discourse. And that is my contribution that I wanted to offer in today's event. So without further ado, I'll just pull up my slide deck. So today I'll be talking about building a movement, and we can build a movement on so many different policy advocacy issues. As I was mentioning, I'll do a bit of a case study approach. And really the two terms I really want you to be on the lookout for throughout the presentation, and the two concepts I want you to really tune into, is the idea of collective action and the idea of public discourse, influencing the public discourse. I also wanted to begin with the land acknowledgement. So I'm currently based in Toronto, also known as Takaranto, which is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also, when I do land acknowledgements, want to share my own journey of migration. So my family and I was born in India, specifically in a suburb close to Hyderabad. Then my family immigrated to Saudi Arabia and Yemen for, economic prosperity and more economic opportunities. And then my family settled here in Canada, and I've been here ever since. So that's a bit of my journey coming to this land. And I take very seriously my obligations as a settler on this land, and also my unique positionality as an immigrant to this land as well. So I did want to open it with that. So as I was mentioning, today I'll talk a bit about my journey, the real power that civil society has. And I've heard this throughout a few of the presentations already, and just even the messaging around this conference. It's really important for civil society, so nonprofits and charities, to be at the decision-making table, sharing their experiences. And I'll share some of the things that I've seen civil society has been able to bring to the table that I think other pillars of society can't, and why it's really important for us to show up and be there, and engaging in government and engaging the government and engaging in advocacy. And the three case studies I'll be sharing today is some of the work that I've done around paid sick leave, the work that I've been part of around a feminist recovery, and then also the work that I'm doing right now at Plan International Canada around addressing the global food security crisis and ways that the Canadian government can contribute to that. So in terms of my milestones, I wanted to give you just a bit of an overview of my career journey, because I have found each of these experiences has been critical to my advocacy experience and my advocacy style. So I spent a number of years as a research fellow at the Wellesley Institute. For folks who are not familiar, it's a think tank that's based in Toronto that focuses on advancing health equity through action on the social determinants of health. So really there I got to hone my skills, not only in research and policy, but also knowledge translation. And I think that focus on strategic communications really came out from my experiences there. And the importance of us not only thinking about what our recommendations are and backing that up with strong evidence, but also looking at how do we invite different constituents, different audiences to be part of that journey, to be part of that conversation. And I think also the think tank approach to doing policy recommendations has really, I would say, influenced the way I did policy work moving forward in my career. And, you know, after the Wellesley Institute, I spent a number of years at YWCA Canada, leading their advocacy, public policy, and strategic communications. And one of the case studies I'll be sharing today is from my time there. So again, about the YWCA, it's the nation's largest and oldest gender equity organization. And I'll share a bit more in a few minutes why that's important, that particular positionality that the YWCA has in the Canadian ecosystem. And there I did a lot of work around gender equity, looking at that through a pan-Canadian lens, and also specifically looking at issues related to economic justice, addressing gender-based violence, looking at things like housing and homelessness through a gender lens, and also looking at issues like childcare, which we were, I would say in many ways, quite pleased with some of the recent developments here in Canada. Currently, I serve, as Puneet mentioned a bit earlier, as the Director of Youth Leadership and Policy Advocacy at Plan International Canada. At this organization, my remit is more global in nature. And really, it's been this really exciting opportunity to look at how do we activate the citizenship and leadership of young people across Canada to be advocates, and connecting that directly to our work influencing Canadian and global decision makers around children's rights and equality for girls. So one of the examples I'll share is some of the work that we're doing around the global food security crisis. That's currently a big concern globally in the international development and humanitarian assistance sector. And I'll say other things besides, I would say, my paid roles. I found a lot of enrichment in my experiences outside of, you know, those traditional 9-to-5 jobs. And it's been through some of the advocacy work I've been part of through the Y7 and W20 and the Commission on the Status of Women. And I wanted to just touch a bit on that because those are also very powerful advocacy spaces that can be leveraged to push issues here domestically. So that's something I wanted to kind of give folks a bit of awareness of. And also, I enjoy the fact that I get to continue to keep my foot in the think tank world through my fellowship at the Public Policy Forum. So if folks have a few questions about that later on, open to it. Right now, one of the areas I'm focusing on during my fellowship there is looking at the impact the nonprofit and charitable sector has on public policy. And that's going to be a future area of research and interest for me while I'm at the Public Policy Forum. So just to, you know, kind of bring it to why it's so important for civil society to participate and show up in different advocacy spaces. I see the power of civil society in three ways. I see civil society as an incredible convener because of that trusting relationships you hold with your stakeholders. You are perhaps able to bring people around the table in a way that no other part of society can. And that is something that should be applauded and really leveraged when it comes to advocacy, because the ability to convene even geographically, that is of great value, especially when it comes to advocacy on a local and municipal level or even provincial or territorial, but also that ability to bring folks together from different parts of society. So bringing labor unions together with the corporate sector and bringing the government together alongside civil society, that's something I would say out of all those different aspects of society, civil society has a distinct way of doing it that I think is really powerful. Civil society is also an important catalyst. So oftentimes when people think of charities and nonprofits and grassroots advocacy groups and advocacy groups at large, they may have an initial impression that it's perhaps mostly about service delivery, but I see it as so much more than that. It's an incredible place for building community. It's an incredible place to figure out who is falling through the cracks. I often see that civil society is perhaps more aware of trends before any other pillar of society, because they're there when people are falling through the cracks, when public policy perhaps is no longer fit for purpose. This is something that I've definitely seen in my career, whether it's been during the pandemic or even beyond. In times of crisis, it's usually the nonprofits and the charitable sector that steps up for society and is that canary in the coal mine of perhaps bigger challenges that are on the horizon. And then finally, what I wanted to also mention is the real value there is for civil society when we as a sector engage in all aspects of the policy cycle. So not only after a policy has been implemented, and that's sometimes where the rubber hits the road because we see something being implemented and we're seeing the communities we serve are not being adequately served or are falling through the cracks. But there's also real value, even in the formulation of policy, even in the formulation of what the policy options can be for civil society to have a seat at the table. And that can happen without that relationship building. So that's hopefully something I wanted to also, through some of the different case studies I mentioned, highlight, because there's real power in actually being part of the crafting of policy even before it comes into implementation, and it goes through the policy cycle as a whole. So in terms of influencing, so one of the terms I wanted to introduce folks to today is this idea of influencing, and this is something we talk a lot about at Plan International Canada. It's this idea that there's so much that goes into influencing policy issues. It's everything from, of course, that policy and research and that real concrete recommendation development and policy development. It looks like interesting partnerships. During my time, for example, at the YWCA, one of the interesting partnerships we had that really pushed the needle on addressing the needs of equity-seeking groups when it came to online hate was an interesting partnership that we had with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So we had, the largest and oldest gender equity organization joining forces with an organization's mandate that was on racial justice and race relations, and coming together to talk about the impacts that online hate has on women of color, specifically young women of color. And we did a really interesting public engagement campaign, and that was truly possible because of that interesting partnership, because each of the organizations brought something distinctive to the table. And so that could also be part of your influencing strategy as well, influencing organizations, but also being in partnership with different parts of society to see what interesting conversations can be convened as a result. It's also something that involves advocacy, which can include government relations, but also can include influencing other types of decision makers within the ecosystem. It's also something that's really connected to public mobilization. This is definitely the work that I've done around paid sick leave, for example. One person saying a particular advocacy recommendation is helpful, but when you're able to bring in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, hundreds of people together around a similar issue and really start to build that movement, that's where you really see that change in political will and decision makers really taking quite seriously what you have to say and starting to work with you on those issues. And of course, we've also, included strategic communications. So how do you get your messages out there to different audiences in the ways that work best for them? So for us, often at Plan International Canada, we talk a lot about our toolbox. How can we actually leverage the different tools in our influencing toolbox for that systemic change? So I also want to give a shout out to the Ontario Nonprofit Network. They've developed a very interesting tool, and if you definitely go on their page, you can learn more. But I wanted to take this one particular image, which is the advocacy spectrum. And what they've looked at is the different ways that nonprofits and charities can engage in advocacy, things that are more upstream and perhaps, more proactive, and things that are also downstream and also perhaps are more in response to issues, but also may require less resources initially. So just to give you a snapshot or just a flavor for the different ways that civil society can engage. And, if you're at this conference, likely you're already engaging in some of these different ways. But I think also this tool gives you insight into maybe other ways that you can engage. So on the left side, just downstream, it can start by joining a coalition, by joining a network. There's so much power in actually sharing intel across organizations and also just different approaches. So even building that community of practice for yourself is an act of advocacy and will help to engender that culture of advocacy at your organization and help support building that movement, because then you have a sense of what other organizations are doing, what campaigns they're active on, how your organization can show up, what can you bring to the table. And I think what's really special about advocacy and being part of a movement is that we all can bring something distinctive to the table as individuals and as organizations. So, a very practical example, if your organization has space for meetings, has space for events, has infrastructure for hosting online events, that is something that you can contribute to a movement. That is something you can contribute to the cause. So I just wanted to kind of take this moment to say that every single contribution is helpful. And sometimes it's, when you're in those joint spaces and in those coalition or network meetings, you get a sense of like, what can you bring to the table that no one else can? And so if you aren't yet part of a network or a coalition, highly recommend, especially if you are a service delivery organization, connecting with a network or a coalition that's related to perhaps some of the service delivery you do, and maybe other parts of that sector or that sector network or coalition are perhaps more at the advocacy, that enables you to be connected to it and, take on what you feel most relevant to your organization. Other ways, of course, just kind of moving up that kind of spectrum is, posting things on social media, signing petitions, writing a letter to government. These are all worthwhile endeavors to push your priorities forward and push your advocacy work forward as an organization. And you can start to then also be a bit more public or a bit more engaging the broader community, not just the government. So I'm a big believer in the power of influencing the public discourse, because what it does is it creates space for your advocacy to breathe. It creates space for your advocacy to actually start to build momentum. And I'll share in one of the case studies how we leverage that particular tactic to build our movement and influence the public discourse. But it can look like writing an op-ed or a blog post in your local paper. You can actually even take that to the next level. A lot of community newspapers across the country, and I'll say particularly in Ontario, there are opportunities to start to establish a relationship with newspapers and say, hey, we would love, once a month to contribute an article. Can we have an ongoing relationship? Can we have an ongoing column? That creates additional space for folks to know about your issues, to know about the challenges that you're experiencing, but also potential solutions. So that's something that I think people don't always think about, but there's an opportunity to also transform that one-off op-ed, that one-off blog post to see if there's something longer lasting in terms of relationship building with that publisher you can do. And this is, of course, I mentioned newspapers, but there's all sorts of publications out there that you can start to look at those types of relationships, those types of opportunities for your organization. And, just to kind of build on this spectrum, other things that you can start to consider are also writing submissions to government. I'll see if I can place a link in the chat a bit later on. Right now, a lot of my work is primarily federal and I'm more global, but before in my career, I was doing more provincial and municipal work as well. There's so many different ways that civil society can actually participate in those government processes. Sometimes it's around things like budgets. So, the Ontario budget just came out a few weeks ago, as did the federal budget. In the lead up to that, there's often different opportunities for organizations to provide their own submissions for what they would like to see in the budget, their own financial recommendations, but also legislative recommendations, for example. So right now, a big hot topic in the nonprofit and charitable sector, of course, is Bill S-216, which is all about direction control. So numerous organizations across the country put in their submissions on that issue in particular. And so while that was not necessarily a financial request, that was something that had implications on the Income Tax Act, and the Ministry of Finance had to be aware of that. So that's an opportunity for you to contribute your insights. Coming from the gender equity sector, the Standing Committee on the Status of Women at the federal level often has different studies. So right now, I believe they have a study on the impacts of gender-based violence on rural women. So if your organization does work on that, that would be a fantastic opportunity for you to inform policymaking through that venue. And I want to bring attention to this because I don't think often organizations who are first starting out know about this, and even established organizations may not really leverage this particular avenue, but it is a really important way of getting your organization's expertise out there to inform public policy. And it's also something, depending on what the particular submission is, it's a way of activating your movement, activating your supporter base to also contribute towards, putting their own submissions in if it makes sense for a particular issue. And then finally, maybe just the last thing I'll mention kind of on this advocacy spectrum is around actually connecting with decision makers. And it could be something where you do it large scale lobby day. I've done that in the past in organizations I've been part of, and you all go with one key policy recommendation, 20, 30, 40 of you are all meeting with different members of parliament or different elected officials, all with the common message. One way to take that to the next level and really showcase that movement that you are part of is to actually bring different parts of society together in those types of lobby days. So one of the things that I've done in the past around paid sick leave, for example, is we would bring together workers, we would bring together organizations like employers who, can see the benefit of paid sick leave. And we would also bring in public health professionals because we were able to make the connection that paid sick leave is also a public health good. And we've seen that very clearly in the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, some of the organizing around paid sick leave really brought together workers organizations with public health professionals, and it was a powerful combination. And that's something you can employ in future lobby days as well, or even meetings with members of parliament, ministers, and other other parliamentarians or elected officials. So that's just to give you a flavor, all the different ways your organization can show up in advocacy. And all of this to say, sometimes it's this idea of seasons. Maybe your organization is not yet ready to kind of be in that upstream phase. Or on the flip side, your organization has been doing a lot of lobby days and meetings with ministers and meetings with members of parliament, but maybe you want to start to figure out, do we want to maybe change our policy priorities? And while you're doing that, you can also shift your strategies as well. So this is truly something where it depends on your organization and your organization's needs, but there's real opportunity if you're able to engage in these different tools and tactics strategically. So I want to now go into some of those case studies so you can get a flavor of how, different organizations and campaigns have taken on that building of movement and that opportunity to activate collective action or influence public discourse. So in 2016, I was involved with the Decent Work and Health Network. If you haven't heard of them, I definitely encourage you to check out just really remarkable work that they're doing at the intersection of employment and labor alongside public health. And in 2016, there was a big opportunity in Ontario to really change the first time in a generation, Ontario's employment and labor laws. And this is really important because oftentimes, and this is the case across many different policy areas, what was working 10, 20, 30 years ago is no longer working for the society we're currently living in. And that was certainly the case with respect to Ontario's employment and labor legislation and standards. And so one of the areas, there was a number of issue areas that the Decent Work and Health Network was active on, but one of them was around paid sick leave and really making that strong connection around paid sick leave and the importance of the impact that it has on public health, not only for the individual, but the entire population writ large. And, we've seen that very clearly in the pandemic. And I think, in many ways, I think about if some of the things that we were pushing for in 2016 were implemented right away, there would have been a potential difference in how we were able to handle new crises as they came to the forefront. But it really also shows, sometimes it takes a long time for the policy wins that we want to have happen and the importance of staying vigilant. But there's a real opportunity when we're able to carve out that space. And I also wanted to say what was really interesting to me with respect to the paid sick leave conversation, this was something unions had been talking about for a very long time. But what I think the Decent Work and Health Network did is that they were able to activate the space where they had a lot of credibility and connection to, which was medical professionals, public health professionals, physicians, nurses, health professionals of all kinds, and really galvanize that group, because I think that added another type of constituency to this broader labor conversation, which I think was quite exciting. So I just want to give you just a quick photo of one of the tactics that the Decent Work and Health Network used. So they had, their policy recommendations, they had their reports, they did a lot of media as an entity. There's a lot of research that came out as well. So there's a lot of connection with the Decent Work and Health Network and St. Michael's Hospital, in particular, Dr. Andrew Pinto. He's done a lot of incredible research on this topic and just the efficacy of putting in paid sick leave and how it actually minimizes infections, improves mental health, and a whole range of health conditions. But one of the tactics they use to really activate collective action and really create this sense of momentum and movement building was the work they did to really engage the broader public. So this is a photo from a number of years ago. We were at one of the major transit hubs in the city, one of the major TTC areas, TTC stations. I think this was a Dufferin station. And often a number of the people that were going through Dufferin Station were workers that were likely not having access to paid sick leave. So typically folks who are in non-standard employment arrangements, so folks perhaps who are in temporary work arrangements or are doing part-time work or seasonal work, often folks who are also paid lower wages. And so one of the things that we did was to really go to where workers were at. And, one of the things often that is a challenge in organizing is not everyone works 9 to 5. And so you have to go to where people are, which is maybe early mornings or late nights. And so one of the things we did as a collective is actually do a bit of petition signing and creating an opportunity for us to directly speak with workers who may benefit from things like paid sick leave and having that legislated across the province. And so this is a powerful combination of, we worked a lot with the Workers Action Center. This involved the Decent Work and Health Network. We engaged different types of health professionals and really put that public health lens on the issue of paid sick leave. And so this is just one example that your organization may decide in terms of, how you can encourage your volunteers and people who are active on your issues to also be out there in the public and start to create also a bit of a media moment. So one of the things also that was quite interesting about this is that, we were able to leverage this space for writing op-eds about why it was important to do paid sick leave and also get a bit of media coverage on radio and TV as well, because it was a bit of a moment that we were able to create in the campaign. And then we were also very active, during May Day rallies and other types of big rallies that were happening around labor rights and really showing a strong health contingent in those spaces as well. And so this is, I think a tactic sometimes that we don't always have the opportunity to leverage as nonprofits and charities. But I think this is something, it is nonpartisan. It is an opportunity to show up for a cause and also to show that you have a stake in the issue as well. So this was something we did as part of the Decent Work and Health Network. And just to kind of show a bit about where we're at. So in the 2021 federal election, a lot of the work that the Decent Work and Health Network, their research that they had published, their reports that they had put out, gained a lot of traction. And actually one of the things that the Prime Minister committed to is in the first 100 days that he would enact 10 paid sick leaves for federally regulated workplaces. And so we did see, for example, Bill C3 did receive royal assent back in December, but we're still waiting for it to come into force. But just to kind of show a bit of that closure and that, closing the loop on, some of the work that, really started in 2015, 2014. I joined in a bit in 2016, but really, that long journey, but all the different ways that you can be part of that change And so we have seen, just to give you that update, a bit of traction with that work at the federal level. I'm still waiting for it to come into force, but it is that ongoing piece of work that we want to stay vigilant on. So in terms of other campaigns, so I was mentioning a bit earlier, I had spent close to 3.5 years at YWCA leading the advocacy, public policy, and strategic communications function. And one of the things, that really came to light during the pandemic is that as an organization, the YWCA Canada has been around for 150 plus years now, I think 152. And when we were actually, even just pre-pandemic, we were in the process of figuring out how we would celebrate this particular milestone. We were going back through the archives, and when the pandemic hit, we were still in that work. And what was really interesting is, I think we had implicitly known, but it was really a great revealer, was that this was not the first pandemic that we as an organization had experienced. We were there during the 1917 flu. And, what was true then was true now with this pandemic, was that in times of crisis, what you need more than anything is care and community. And that was really great to lean into that history of the organization and see that we had come through this before, but also recognize, we needed a new playbook to address the challenges of our time. This is no longer something that, in previous economic recessions and other crises, it was something that perhaps impacted jobs in male-dominated sectors. And so sometimes the recommendations would be to invest more in roads and bridges and construction and more male-dominated sectors. But because of who had been impacted by this pandemic and how, we needed a new approach. And that's where our work on a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada came in. So this was, again, an interesting partnership between two organizations, one a civil society organization, YWCA Canada, and another an academic institution, so the University of Toronto's Institute for Gender and the Economy. And that created this incredible partnership that really helped to drive this idea of feminist recovery in the public discourse, but also created opportunities for collective action for the YWCA movement and beyond to really push this agenda forward. So what were some of the things that we did? So first, I wanted to just mention a bit of the different pillars. So it was 8 pillars and 27 recommendations. I won't go into the full details. Of people who are interested, definitely check out feministrecovery.ca, where you can see the entire report and all the different recommendations. But I think one of the things that was quite interesting is that we were able to really leverage the insights that we had as a civil society organization to develop the recommendations. So we were doing a lot of work, for example, in childcare and the care economy. So that featured as a central pillar of our plan. We also did work around economic justice. We did work on gender-based violence. So talking about the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence was important. And it was interesting because people were curious to see that in an economic recovery plan. But our argument was, and we also had data points to back this up, that in times of, in a climate of hate, fear, and violence, economic prosperity cannot thrive. And that was something that was really important for us to make front and center. We also leveraged, of course, the GATES areas of expertise around bolstering small businesses, and also for both organizations talking about things like infrastructure and diverse voices in decision-making, and bringing it all back to intersectionality and understanding a one-size-fits-all approach would not work. And we can't talk about any of these issues without addressing systemic racism. So that was our economic recovery plan in a nutshell. But what was really interesting is that this was the first nationally focused recovery plan of its kind in the world. And it was something that was inspired out of some great work that was coming out of the state of Hawaii. But in Canada, there was actually nothing like this happening. And so for us, when I was at YWCA Canada, as a pan-Canadian organization with this mandate around gender equity, it made a lot of sense for us to participate and bring some thought leadership to this area because there was currently a vacuum that was there. And that created a lot of interesting ripple effects that we were able to leverage to really push these issues forward. So just to give you a sense, one of the things that really worked in our favor in terms of that knowledge mobilization was that partnerships piece. So partnerships between the YWCA and the Institute for Gender and the Economy, but then also partnerships within the YWCA Federation. So I think I'm seeing some of the names who are asking, chiming in the chat. Many of you may be part of federations as well. And that is a great opportunity to really take an issue and build a movement for it, because you already have those connections, perhaps from coast to coast to coast or within your province and territory. But if you're able to actually take an issue and inspire and engage all of your membership, there's an incredible activation that's possible for your issue. And really the opportunity to build a movement is so strong there in a federation environment. So that's something that we definitely leveraged when I was at the YWCA. One of the other things that we did as well is that we knew if we wanted to really create that credibility for our recommendations, it was not enough to just have our recommendations, but also to invite other people into the conversation. So we had a number of expert reviewers who chimed in and gave in their feedback, which was fantastic. And what that actually did was that they actually became our biggest advocates as well. And we also, of course, engaged in government relations. So one of the things that we did was, as soon as the report got launched, which I have it starkly in my mind, July 20th, 2020, which was just honestly months since the pandemic started, we sent it to every single elected official at the federal level so that they were at least aware. And that also created the opportunity for us to have meetings, for our membership, our federation members to also have meetings. But we wanted to essentially consolidate all of the results, all of the recommendations, and provide it as a package. And that really enabled us to position the report quite well. Also, we were able to do a lot of media relations. So we had over 300 news articles that covered the launch of the report itself. And one of the things we did is we actually hosted a launch event on the day that it was being published. And that was something we invited journalists to. So they were actually able to, have access to the report, of course, an embargoed version, but actually hear a panel discussion about the issues talked about in the report to give additional flavor to why this issue was important. And that is something I definitely wanted to share with all of you. That might be an interesting tactic that you can leverage in the future for wanting to build momentum and influencing the public discourse on your issue. And I think finally, something, and it goes back to partnerships as well, is that we really engaged both the business community, so chambers of commerce across the country, as well as labor unions. So we were able to go out of just our traditional gender equity stakeholders. We were able to connect with other pillars of society that I think really took this work to the next level. This is just a snippet of some of the different op-eds that we put out in different papers. So one in the Toronto Star, another in Corporate Knights. We're looking at different types of publications. We were also able to build a movement by leveraging our connection as part of a federation to encourage our membership from coast to coast to coast, from BC to Ontario, to Newfoundland and Labrador and parts in between, to talk about this issue and talk about why a feminist recovery was important. And one of the interesting things that came out of that is originally our focus was really pushing issues at a federal level, but because of this engagement by our membership, we were actually able to push out feminist recovery conversations in provinces. So we were able to do specific advising to the government of British Columbia as they were thinking about their recovery plan and really pushing a feminist recovery recommendations. We were also able to do that, for example, in Niagara region as well. So locally talking about feminist recovery policy recommendations as well. So really it started to be something that was federal initially, but really became pan-Canadian, which is something we're quite proud of. We were also able to engage the UN in this conversation as well, because it was the first nationally focused feminist recovery plan of its kind. And we were also able to really be part of a community of practice of feminist recovery plans that were happening from across the country. So we had colleagues in BC doing a BC version of a feminist recovery plan. We also had colleagues in Ottawa doing one locally for the city of Ottawa as well. So that was exciting to be part of that community of folks pushing for feminist recovery in Canada. And then finally, in terms of our impact, so I mentioned the report came out July 2020. By September 2020, we actually did see in the fall economic statement measures put towards talking about a feminist and intersectional response to the pandemic and recovery, conversations about an action plan for women in the economy and investments in childcare. And then a couple of weeks later, the actual, in April, the budget came out as well in 2021. And we did see a number of our recommendations in that final budget piece, which was quite exciting to see. And so that's a bit about the feminist recovery work. I am probably coming up at my time. So I did want to just mention very briefly some of our food security work as well. This is something that I'm currently doing at Plan International Canada. So right now there's 45 million children who are suffering from one of the most life-threatening forms of malnutrition. And we also know from a gender perspective that often it's not just children generally, it's usually girls who are often eat less and eat last. And this is something that has tremendous gender implications from increases in early forced and child marriage, impacts on economic prosperity. We also see that this can lead to issues of gender-based violence writ large. So the food security crisis can have ripple effects, and often those ripple effects are quite gendered and generational in nature. And what we've seen is with the crisis currently in Ukraine, this has also had an impact on the global food supply. So some of the issues that were present pre-pandemic and even pre the conflict in Ukraine are being exacerbated by the current crisis. And so one of the things we've been doing is, we at Plan International Canada engage young people from coast to coast to coast. Over the last 6 years, we've engaged 3.5 million young people in our advocacy, in our public policy, in our influencing work. And one of the tactics we've used to really support youth advocates in their policy influencing work is to create content that's dedicated to their needs and really tailors content towards their perspectives. We've also been doing a lot of social media. We've also been doing a lot of capacity building with our youth advocates around government relations and policy advocacy, so we can also support them in making those asks of elected politicians around how Canada can step up its contribution to addressing the global food security crisis. And one of the things we've also been doing is really engaging in that targeted government relations work. And one of the examples, we recently, just a couple of weeks ago, met with Minister Sajjan on this particular issue and a number of other issues. And this was something where we learned more about his commitment to the global food security crisis and how he's hoping to take up Canada's contribution. So it was a great way for us to share our expertise as an international development organization and some of what we're seeing in the countries we work in globally, but also hear directly from him how we can work together on pushing this issue forward. So one of the things we've heard is that Canada is going to be doing more on this issue, but also pushing its G7 and G20 colleagues. So for us, because we're part of a global organization, we're also looking at how can we activate our global networks of Plan colleagues on this issue as well. So that's been something, sometimes there's opportunities that come up because of that opportunity to engage directly with decision makers. And maybe the last thing I'll end on is, really taking those opportunities when you engage with decision makers to document that, to amplify that, to using things like social media. So this is an example of a tweet after we saw the minister tweeted about the meeting. And what it does, it builds credibility and momentum for your recommendations. So this is something that we try to employ every time we connect with a decision maker, whether it's a federal member of parliament, a senator, or another stakeholder. It's always important to put that work and build that momentum for the issues that you're working on. So maybe to end in terms of lessons learned. So through all of these different case studies that I've shared, and also just my experiences in advocacy and government relations writ large, the biggest thing, the biggest piece of advice I can give is, coming with a clear recommendation and also understanding what your organization brings to the table that makes you uniquely positioned to comment on the issue. So with respect to, for example, paid sick leave, we had a very clear ask, 10 paid sick days, and ensuring that that was something that was accessible to all workers, regardless of a worker arrangement or employment arrangement. And also understanding that our ability to comment on the issue through a public health lens was powerful, and really leaning into that. So oftentimes what I've seen is that as organizations, we really understand the challenges. Sometimes it's hard to figure out very discreetly what is the recommendation. And I'll say in those conversations you have with elected officials, that's often what they want to know. What can we do? And if you can present a solution, that makes the work that much easier to move forward. I think also what I've seen really work well for organizations, and even in my own experiences, is when you leverage a diverse range of tools in your influencing toolbox. So not just limiting yourself to one particular tactic, but really giving yourself the opportunity to engage on a number of them, because all of those contribute. And the great thing is, if you're part of a coalition or a network, it doesn't mean maybe that you as a single organization have to employ all those tactics, but as a campaign, you are making sure you're not leaving any stone unturned. I think I mentioned this before. For me, what I see really valuable is keeping the policy window open. What's been really interesting with the pandemic is that it's created a policy window for things to move forward at speeds that we haven't seen in previous decades when it comes to different policy areas and different policy issues. And to some extent, the window is still there, but it is starting to close. And one of the ways that we can keep that window open is to keep our issues in the limelight, to keep our issues in the spotlight. And one of the ways is through that media relations, is through that work around influencing the public discourse. It can also mean being part of public education events and educating your set of supporters so they're aware and they can push that issue forward. It's not always about media, but that's a very powerful tactic in keeping the space open for your advocacy. I think also what's really exciting is creating opportunities for your pool of advocates to co-create campaign activations. So looking at, when I was doing work around paid sick leave, there's particular spaces that public health professionals can engage in that perhaps the general public can't. So how do we leverage those spaces? It's also looking at, the work that I'm doing at Plan International Canada around youth advocates, working with them around where do they want to see campaign activations? Is it using different social media tools, for example? Is it actually engaging their sphere of influence, which might be post-secondary institutions or other types of spaces that they have access to? So it's looking at how do you co-create those campaign activations. And then for me, the biggest thing has been keeping the momentum going by telling your story of advocacy and activism, but also why your issues are important and keeping that in that public discourse. So with that, I'd like to end and just wanted to say it's been such a pleasure to share about my experiences and look forward to any questions that you may have. And please feel free to reach out on Twitter or LinkedIn to stay connected. Thank you so much, and looking forward to staying connected with all of you.
Thank you so much, Anjum. That was really fascinating to me. I know that we're a bit beyond our schedule, but one of the things I found really fascinating about your presentation was so many practical tips that you've shared with folks, and using the Ontario Nonprofit Network's advocacy spectrum. That was a great idea. I've seen that before, but very quickly, just one quick question for you, if you don't mind. But so there's obviously a whole bunch of things that nonprofits can do in terms of advocacy. You spoke about them on the map, but how do you develop that strategy? Do you develop it at the beginning of the year? Do you develop your advocacy strategy based on what? On what you're reading, what your members are saying, what your supporters are saying? How do you actually develop that strategy and then move it forward with the activities? If you could answer that quickly, that would be great.
Yeah, so I definitely see it as two things, like content and tactics. For us, the content is always around where we have credibility, where does it make sense for us to speak? So for a service delivery organization, it makes sense for us to speak on issues like childcare when I was at the YWCA, because we're one of the nation's largest providers of childcare. Maybe the green jobs conversation is not as timely just because we're not doing that work. So first it comes from where do we have credibility to speak? And then it's around what spaces do we have access to? What are our spheres of influence? And also sometimes what do we have budget or resources for? So I sometimes like to look at, for us, when I was at the YWCA, for example, we really developed a very strong skill set around strategic communications and around the pan-Canadian reach. And so that was one of the tactics we leveraged because that's a resource we brought to the table. When I was at the Decent Work and Health Network, for us, we were researchers by training, many of us. So using research as a tactic to push our issues forward made a lot of sense for us because that's something we had as skill set and access in terms of the different platforms. And at Plan, one of the things that we do really well is youth engagement. So that was a tactic it makes sense for us to really dive into because that is part of our organization's reach and ecosystem. So sometimes taking stock of what is it that you're good at and seeing how you can leverage that to bring yourself to the movement, to that issue area.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anjum. Again, it was so full of practical tips, just like all the other presentations, but thank you. Please stay on if you can. And I appreciate you participating, but thank you again, Anjum.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to you and the organizers for making this space possible, because I don't think there's enough spaces for us to learn from each other. So appreciate being here. Thank you again.
Thank you.